In another video, we saw the purely competitive industry. Let's now move to the opposite extreme of industry structure and look at the monopoly. While a purely competitive industry has so many producers that each one individually has no effect on the market, a monopoly industry has only one producer, and that producer has a substantial effect on the market. The monopoly industry has the following attributes. There's one firm, the firm is large, and there may or may not be free entry and exit to the industry. To say that the firm is large means that the quantity of output it produces constitutes a significant portion of the total industry output. If a large firm increases its rate of production, it creates a surplus and the equilibrium price of the product falls. If a large firm decreases its rate of production, it creates a shortage and the equilibrium price of the product rises. If there is free entry to the monopoly industry, we say that the monopoly is a natural monopoly. That is, given the freedom to choose, no other firm will want to enter the industry and compete with the monopoly. If there's not free entry to the monopoly industry, we say that the monopoly is an artificial monopoly. That is, the only reason the firm is a monopoly is because of some sort of governmental regulation. Given the choice, other firms would enter this industry and compete with a single firm. Natural monopolies tend to be short-lived. Even though a firm is a natural monopoly within its industry, new technologies will cause other industries to emerge that compete with the monopoly's industry. For example, IBM was a near monopoly in the computing industry, but when software started to become more important than hardware, Microsoft supplanted IBM as the computing industry leader. When the internet started to become more important than standalone software, Google began to supplant Microsoft. The U.S. Postal Service is an example of an artificial monopoly. By law, only the U.S. Postal Service can deliver first-class mail. If this law were rescinded, other firms would enter the mail delivery business and compete. We know this because it's happened with second and third-class mail and special deliveries. Because other firms are not barred from delivering these types of mail, we have firms such as Pure Later Courier, Federal Express, United Parcel Service, and Emory all in the same industry together. When we introduced marginal revenue, it was within the context of a purely competitive industry. In that context, we said that marginal revenue could be thought of as the price of the firm's product. For example, if a firm sells its product for $10 a unit, every time the firm sells another unit of product, its revenue rises by $10. Thus, the marginal revenue is $10. This is not the case in the context of other industry types. Suppose, for example, that Microsoft is a monopoly that sells copies of Windows for $100 each and produces 1,000 copies per day. What happens if Microsoft decides to increase its output by 1 unit to 1,001 copies per day? Because Microsoft is a large firm, its actions affect the market. Starting at equilibrium, when Microsoft increases its output, it creates a surplus of the software, and so the price of the software falls. So while Microsoft can sell 1,000 copies per day at a price of $100 each, if it were to increase its output to 1,001 copies per day, the resulting surplus would cause the price of the product to fall to $99. The result is that Microsoft's price is $100, but its marginal revenue is $99. If it sells one more copy of Windows per day, it doesn't get another $100 per day. It gets another $99 per day. Thus, a monopoly's marginal revenue is always less than the price of its product. So the question is, why do we care about any of this and what does it tell us? In each of these cases, we talk about the purely competitive industry, the monopoly industry, the oligopoly industry, the monopolistic competitive industry. In each case, what we're trying to do is get our heads around why is it that firms act the way they do. And in the case of monopoly, this is particularly helpful because people are naturally afraid of monopolies. There are these big things, and we imagine that they're bad because, and people frequently say this, monopolies are bad because they can charge whatever price they want. And it turns out that's not the case at all. A monopoly can ask whatever price it wants, the same as any firm can. But whether or not it gets the price depends on whether or not consumers are willing to pay it. Now you can say, well, but the monopoly is the only entity that's selling this particular product, and what if it's a product that you really need? Well, this is very interesting. If this is a product that you really need, and there's only one seller of it, and that seller has jacked his price way up high, so it's really difficult for you to get hold of this product now, what you have just described is a fantastic opportunity for entrepreneurs. For someone to come in and say, I can do that more cheaply, I can undercut this guy. And you can say, well, this is a monopoly. If you try and come in and undercut me, I'll just drop my price and put you out of business. Fair enough. So I'll come up with an alternate technology. For example, this is what Google did. So Google didn't see any sense in competing with Microsoft in the operating system space. Microsoft owned that space, and if Google came into it, Microsoft would drop the price in its product and put Google out of business. So what does Google do? Google comes in and starts up an entirely new industry. And it's not Google competing with Microsoft, it's Google's industry competing with Microsoft's industry. And all of a sudden you realize that this thing that we thought of as a monopoly is only a monopoly within the confines of its industry. You start having entrepreneurs create alternative industries, and now you have competition across industries, and you realize this firm is not the thing to be afraid of that you thought it was. What we should be afraid of is artificial monopolies. And by that I don't mean necessarily the monopoly itself, but rather the conditions that have caused it to be an artificial monopoly. When we have an artificial monopoly, what's happened is the government has come in and drawn a line around this and said no one can play in this space except for this favored firm. The problem with that is this space may have lots of profit opportunities, and if it does, when we stop entrepreneurs from coming in here, we prevent the market from coming up with new ways of doing this thing or new products or new innovations that would be good for consumers. None of that happens because we've drawn an artificial line around this space and said no one can play here except this guy.